Hey, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Let's talk about anger and the wisdom of anger. We seem to be living in a culture currently where anger is just held out to be this negative, toxic thing that should be avoided at all costs. But there is a wisdom in anger, and we could even say that there is such a thing as good anger. So let's explore this a little bit. Fundamentally, anger means rule violation. So that if you're angry with someone, it's because you have a rule in your mind or a demand in your mind on behalf of the other person, meaning what they should understand or what they should appreciate or what they should have said or what they should care about. And if you demand that and you simultaneously have the perception that they don't live up to that rule, you're going to get angry. Same with life. If you have some standard for how life absolutely should be or must be, then every time life doesn't unfold that way, you'll get angry. And of course, when it comes to yourself as well, anytime you have some sort of strong demand upon yourself as to what you should have mastered or realized or said or how you should have acted, if you strongly demand that and then have an experience of not living up to it, you're going to have an anger response. So, what anger ultimately does is that it helps you discover your own rules and your own demands and when they seem to be violated. And then you have an opportunity to really question those demands and those rules, um, or to see if you would like to modify them or perhaps try to enforce them or live them in more useful ways. So let me offer a couple of examples from my own life recently. So in the last week, I've had a couple of interesting episodes. I can't remember the last time I expressed anger towards someone in public or at a store, but I did so last week. I went to one of the local food stores to order some food, and there was a new guy there behind the counter who just shot me this really weird look, like this grin that just seemed completely off. And then he took forever to begin to, address me as a customer without seemingly having any reason to. And I ordered what I wanted, and he even gave me the wrong package. So I had paid for it, through the cashier, and I was buying the car when I kind of realized, hey, I've gotten the wrong thing here. So I went back inside, and of course I expected him to acknowledge the mistake and to perhaps apologize and to just fix it. Instead, he just shot me this glare that I perceived as hostility, and he started to just ramble and not really address things. And at that point, I felt this anger, and I let him have it a little bit. Now, I didn't call him bad names, I didn't scream at him or anything, but I just told him, I said, "Hey, dude, if you're gonna work in customer service, there are certain standards. I basically, laid down the law on customer service and how he should have behaved. Now, this woman who worked there came to his rescue and it was like, "Oh, I'm gonna fix this," and she stood, "Oh, I'm gonna go get the boss," and the boss came out and looked concerned, and I told the boss that I'd never asked to speak to the boss, but here was my complaint. And the woman told me, that was rude. That was not a nice way to address things. And I think what happened there is my voice tone, the harshness and the sharpness of my voice tone made it so that the guy who worked there got the sympathy. I think they kind of rallied around him and viewed me as the difficult customer due to the harshness of my voice. Now, what happened there? Did the anger come from his behavior directly? No. What happened there was that I had a rule in my mind of how customer service should be, like a minimal standard, and he violated that rule, and I kept insisting on it. Hence, I had an anger response. Now, contrast this with another example of my life recently where I did not get angry. So, my sister and I, have not really had a relationship for many, many years. We're estranged, so to speak. And to not go into the details of that, but I'm okay with that situation. Now, our mother is not, and I've been very lucky with my mother. She's a very kind and a very loving person, and she means the best. And she's of course not okay with her two grown kids not having anything to do with each other. And when her mood gets low, she'll call me and she'll basically let me have it. And her tool of choice is to try to use shame and guilt. So she'll try to shame me and try to make me feel guilty. And the other day her mood was a bit low, and I talked to her on the phone, and she started doing her guilting and shaming thing. And in that context, I did not, well, I felt a little bit annoyed by it, but I felt warmly towards her because I realized that she was in a low mood, and I realized that she wants the best, even though I find her behavior a bit invasive. Um, but the reason I did not get angry at that is because I don't have a rule or a demand in my mind that my mother must not do that. I've kind of landed at this place where I realize that she's not going to change her mind around this, and that's her tool, uh, even though it doesn't work. So what I did was I enforced my boundary. I said, look, you're trying to guilt me again, and we both know that doesn't work. So you might as well stop. And you know, that's authentic. Now, regarding the situation at the store, um, if I could if I could redo it, or what I've done in my own mind is I've taken a look at how I acted in that situation, and while it felt authentic at the time to kind of, you know, read him his rights regarding horrible customer service, I there's a difference between demanding it of someone and getting angry versus strongly preferring it. Because if you strongly prefer something and it doesn't happen, yeah, it can be annoying or a bit frustrating. But if you demand something and it doesn't happen, it's awful. It's terrible. So if I could do it again, I would have gone up to him and I would have addressed the situation. I would have said, look, I would appreciate if we could do it like this. Um, I might have talked to the manager, but I would have used a different voice tone. I would have been more solution oriented instead of just complaining about, what I perceived to have been the problem, because that would have been right. It would have been authentic in the sense that it is perfectly fine to protest and to stand your ground a bit, when you get customer service, which isn't good. But the problem with expressing anger with that angry voice is that people tend to tune out. They tend to get scared or intimidated or angry back. And as a result of that, they can't really hear your message anymore. That's the problem. Again, what I think happened in that scenario is I think that he kind of got the sympathy because he was, well, a young man and brown skin color, which in progressive Norway, gives you a good ranking in the victim hierarchy. I'm this old, not old, middle-aged heterosexual white guy, and that brings you no virtue in this victim culture of oppressor oppressed Olympics that we currently seem to be living in. So I mean, you don't want to be toothless in this world. We've probably developed the capacity to anger for good reasons, as in that ability to stand your ground, or to set a boundary, or to express yourself when it might be, inconvenient. There's a certain energy in that. So there's a wisdom in anger in telling you that, someone seems to be violating one of your rules or one of your standards. Um, it's always an opportunity then to look at your standards or look at your rules, and ideally turning the musts and the shoulds and the needs back into preferences. That's usually a good thing to do. Sometimes when you do this, you might just realize that this expectation or this rule that I have is just unreasonable and it's stupid and it doesn't work, and I'm just gonna toss it out the window. In other cases, you might realize that no, I'm gonna live according to this, or I'm gonna do my best to enforce this. But very often, what's helpful to do is to enforce the boundaries behaviorally. It's very often a signal to, or a message to get clearer on what your values or what your standards actually are. I remember I worked with this guy who had a teenage daughter who was something of a diva. And she would call him, early Sunday morning after some sort of party, other side of town, and ask her father to pick him up. He was my age, and he would drive across town and sit in his car in minus 10 degrees, and he had this expectation that the teenage daughter would hurry up and show gratitude, but she was something of a diva, so she could spend like 20 minutes hugging people and having conversations, and the father would sit there boiling with anger, that ungrateful teenager. And when I asked him, I said, "Look, if you're really angry, you have a rule that she's violating, some demand of her." And she said, "Yes, she should be grateful, and she should be considerate and come to the car immediately." And I said, "Well, have you communicated that?" And he said, "Yes." "Well, are you still willing to pick her up?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what do you think is a fair amount of time to wait?" And he thought about it, and he said, "Well, 5 or 6 minutes max." I said, "Well, communicate that. And here's your task. The next time she does the diva thing, wait 6 minutes, start the car, slowly drive away, and then drive all the way home. Have some nice music in the car. uh, feel the freedom to enjoy some parental sadism. And a couple of hours later, she came home because she had to take a taxi and wait for the taxi to show up and spend her own money. Uh, but these days, she tends to be out by the car pretty quickly, not because he's angering, but because he's shown his boundary behaviorally. You know, for a lot of people, they're so used to this notion that for me to set a boundary, I need to be really angry. But most of the time, boundaries are better set through behavior and through clarity, like getting clearer on what you're willing to put up with, what you're willing to be part of, and communicating that clearly at a much earlier phase of the relationship or whatever context that you're in. Sometimes people do rage, and I've made a video about this before, but they might be raging. And of course, people have every right to feel whatever they feel. But one of the purposes that rage sometimes has for people is, let's say you've been royally screwed over. Someone's done something horrible to you, or the state has treated you unfairly, you've been sentenced to prison for something you haven't done, like something awful has happened. Um, you get ran over by a drunk driver, and let's say that there's nothing you can do about what happened necessarily. Rage can sometimes give us this pseudo sense of power and agency because when we're full of rage, we feel a sense of power. It can become like a drug. It can seem like a pseudo power in a context where we don't really have it. And then the question becomes, are you willing to surrender to life and to acknowledge, the kind of raw brutality and unpredictability of life? And might we be able to do something meaningful with what has happened and to utilize that good anger, if you will, as fuel? Expressing anger strongly is very seldom productive, in my experience. I mean, if you have young kids, from time to time, you'll probably have to show them a little bit of anger to enforce some boundaries from time to time. I can't quite see how you're going to escape that. And of course, in an acute danger situation, for example, let's say you're running out of a burning building and someone's blocking the entrance and they're not listening, you know, just showing primal anger to get them to move, might be the appropriate thing in that particular context. Or you might have something in life that really matters to you, where you have some principled anger, where you go, I just think this is completely wrong. I'm going to plant my flag. I'm going to fight this fight. I'm going to do this. You might channel it as something productive. But it's still very useful to make a distinction between demanding things of life, as in life must be fair, or other people must respect me, or I must achieve. Albert Ellis used to call this the art of masturbation. There's a world of difference between demanding that and merely strongly preferring it and doing your best. That's the main difference between those who end up with anger problems and those who don't. Now, regarding authenticity, it's something of a tricky topic because on the one hand, you could say that, well, anyone who's angry and who just screams that other system is being authentic, as in there's an alignment between how they're feeling, how they're really feeling, quote unquote, and how they're behaving. But yes, it looks that way when you're in the midst of it. But what I would advise to do is to look at your deeper values. Like, what do you really stand for or want to stand for as a human being? What's your ethical compass? And the question is, are your behaviors in alignment with that? Uh, and look to wisdom. Look at basic values such as freedom and truth and being able to see the interconnectedness of life and how we fundamentally share the same being of consciousness and to live in accordance with that, to see the humanity in other people. I would argue that to the extent that we don't do that, we're out of integrity with our being, with the nature of our interconnectedness, uh, so to speak. So yeah, I hope this was useful as some reflections. I've done a lot of work with people who have anger issues. It's probably the topic where I see the most clients. So if you struggle with anger, irritability, rage, these sorts of things, and you'd like some help, you'd like some coaching in terms of how to change and how to update, how to live in an authentic way, uh, do get in touch through provocativehypnosis.com. Also, look at those core values because what sometimes can happen in life is that we begin to confuse integrity with ideology. If we have these core values and we're so fused with them that they seem to be who we are, that if you don't live this way, it's somehow a violation of who you are. This is an identification with thinking. So ask that question. Am I confusing integrity with ideology? And to the extent that we do that, we lose sight of our own complexity. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening.